Thank you to the staff over at the American Waterworks Association. Just first and foremost, hello to everyone. It was really fun to see folks logging in a bit early. So Michelle and Linda from Florida, Alicia from New York, Kenneth, it looks like you're here in SoCal, neighbors to both Lindsay and I, who are also based here. Eric from Montana, Gary from Maui. We've got folks from all over the country. So just want to say hello and thank you for joining us. And really today's conversation is all about how we focus on decarbonization in the water industry. In its simplest form, decarbonization is the process of reducing or eliminating carbon emissions by transitioning to cleaner energy sources, improving efficiency, and adopting carbon reducing technologies to mitigate climate change. I think it's really important that we get on a baseline of what we mean in fundamental language. And I really want to start with what's the importance of this conversation and why is decarbonization in the water industry crucial? It's crucial for several reasons that I want to mention here. First and foremost, the sector's energy consumption and emissions. Water and wastewater treatment facilities are highly energy intensive. They often rely on non-renewable energy sources, and this contributes significantly to the carbon emissions of our sector. So decarbonizing these processes help reduce the sector's footprint, and it helps meet the global climate targets. So like the takeaway is the water sector has a role to play when we talk about global emissions. The next topic is around climate change resilience. So climate change impacts such as droughts and floods, some of you are experiencing around the country, rising sea levels. This will challenge the stability of water resources and the preparedness of communities. So decarbonization can help mitigate climate change and protect these water resources from short and long-term impacts. The next reason why this is so important for conversation is water security. So efficient water management lessens the strain on natural water resources. And this is really important to water scarcity and our increased resilience. And we're seeing that across the country and globe. The next is public health and ecosystems. So reducing the environmental impact of water resource management, it not only lowers the greenhouse gas emissions, but it's important to preservation of ecosystems and improving public health outcomes. The next is economic benefits. So we know that decarbonization in water management can lead to operational cost savings through energy efficiency, but it can also create diversified revenue sources through the integration of renewable energy. And this is really important when we're talking about the affordability and as increased infrastructure investment requirements continue to put pressure on the customer base. Last but not least is equity and environmental justice. We know that underserved communities, many are located near pollution sources, and this includes fossil fuel-based water treatment facilities. So by shifting to cleaner, carbon neutral treatment solutions, these areas can experience improved air and water quality, and this is really important to addressing exposure to environmental hazards and just promoting environmental justice. So these are just some to note, and these examples illustrate that addressing decarbonization is absolutely vital to how we combat climate change while ensuring long-term availability and health of water resources and the communities in which we live. And so the water sector is a significant consumer of energy, as I mentioned earlier. However, the potential for transformative change is within reach if we can come together to implement new ideas, technologies, and methodologies at scale as a community, as a water industry. So that is why we're here today. Our panelists, they will share with you experiences and how they are advancing the conversation and progress towards the meaningful reduction of emissions. And what I hope you get out of the conversation today is, one, why is decarbonization important and why it matters? Second, that you hear from these industry leaders what's working and ideas so that you can take the conversation and bring that to your spaces. And third, I hope you're inspired with new ideas and enthusiasm so that you can integrate new thinking and problem solving to accelerate change with a sense of urgency. So with that said, some foundational thoughts as we head into the conversation. My name is Christina Ahmedpour. I'm the president of IL Utilities, the North America business. And IL Utilities is a global innovation and technology consultancy. We work with over 400 water utilities around the world, as well as technologists, academic research, investor, and other stakeholders, all looking towards a more resilient future with the water industry. And so we really have the viewpoint that we can tackle multiple pronged challenges, including the decarbonization in water through creativity, collaboration, and problem solving. I will be moderating the conversation today, and I would like to take a moment to introduce the other panelists. So I'll start with Lindsay Struveck. Lindsay is the Sustainable Resource Officer at Multnomah Water District here in Southern California. Lindsay oversees water efficiency, water resource, energy, and operational optimization projects at the district. And Lindsay's career has been focused on and dedicated to sustainable projects, customer interfacing projects, and really looking at data-driven efficiency solutions. A lot of her work is also referenced national in scale, and so she has a passion of how those projects that she's doing at Multnomah Water District can be replicated across the industry. Next, I want to introduce Jane Gajwani. She is the director of the Office of Energy and Resource Recovery Programs at New York City Department of Environmental Protection. Jane has over 25 years of experience working at the intersection of water and energy. And in her capacity working with her team is focused on how the agency is plotting a course to achieve both carbon and energy neutrality. No small challenge ahead of her. And then prior to joining DEP, Jane has worked on a number of municipal, regional, and national levels around the water energy nexus. Next, I want to introduce Greg Semler. He is a veteran entrepreneur, both in the water and energy sector. Greg is the CEO and founder of InPipe Energy. InPipe Energy is a smart water technology company that has developed a patented energy recovery solution, as well as pressure management platform that can generate renewable energy within pipe distribution networks, and also looks at the optimization of those networks. Thank you to Greg as well for helping sponsor this webinar to make this convening possible, as well as your leadership in the industry. Next is George Hawkins. George, we know as a former CEO of DC Water, where he served for 11 years. And years ago, George started his own nonprofit, Moonshot Missions. So Moonshot Mission helps water agencies identify and adopt strategies to deliver better outcomes. There is a focus on small and under-resourced communities, water utilities, so a lot of great work happening. And George brings a wealth of experience, former attorney, professor, advisor, and thought leader, I think notably the White House National Infrastructure Advisory Council in providing leadership on a national level. And then last but not least is Clifford Chan. Clifford Chan has been the general manager of East Bay Mud since 2020, but has worked at East Bay Mud for over 26 years, wearing a number of hats from operations, maintenance, and construction management. A little bit about East Bay Mud is in Northern California, serving the East Bay and serving a population of 1.4 million, biannual budget of $2.7 billion. So a large utility in our sector. So clearly you can all see that I'm a big fan of these folks. They bring a very diverse perspective from technologist, entrepreneur, problem solver, project integrator, champion. So I'm very happy to have such well-rounded perspectives as we go into this conversation. So at this stage, I want to dive right in, and I'm going to start with just a general question I'd like everyone to answer, which is, and really just what's your interest in the topic of decarbonization? What are you passionate about, motivated by? This just helps us sort of understand your perspective and how you see this topic. So Greg, I'm going to start with you as the optimist entrepreneur that you are.
Thanks, Christina, and thanks to the panel for doing this. It's awesome to have all of you, and I love working with all of you. So, I'm an entrepreneur, and so I like to do things that other people haven't done before. And I started InPipe Energy really because I was concerned about the long-term viability and affordability of delivering water in the face of climate change. And so what I saw was energy costs rising and being a really important, I think the second or third highest cost for delivering water. And I saw back when I started InPipe, people in Houston being without water for 5 days because of floods and storms, New Orleans, Atlanta. And even today, we see North Carolina just besieged by a hurricane that I only learned about like a week ago. And I think they're saying almost 500 people are going to die. In California, the electric utility sent us an email yesterday saying power's could be turned off within 24 hours. And immediately when I get those, I think of Clifford. Like, how do you deliver water without power? And so I learned about water. I saw an untapped opportunity to create a product. We call it the HydroXS, but essentially it operates like a control valve. But it replaces it, instead of wasting pressure, it creates a new source of renewable energy. And my vision was really like, how do we get water utilities to use that so that we can ensure that even with climate disruption, droughts, floods, and so forth, we can reduce the costs of delivering water. And so that's what we do at InPipe, is we're always looking for ways to help our customers who are water utilities to reduce the cost, because water is becoming increasingly an affordability issue. And so for me, decarbonization in this topic is all about creating a safe, reliable, efficient system, but it has to be cost effective. And we have to get water utilities to embrace it, because otherwise their customers, the ratepayers, are just not going to be happy. So I spend my time with my team trying to figure out how to create a solution that makes water more affordable.
Addressing the cost element. I like that, Greg. Thank you. What about you, Lindsay?
What Greg said, I agree. I mean, just personally, I've always counted myself as an environmental steward. I've dedicated my education and career to regenerative and system studies. And then I found a wonderful place like Molten Miguel, which really aligns with those values. So I've been very fortunate, but now I'm able to work on water and energy projects, which I agree, there's just a massive nexus there and there's a lot of opportunity. And it's great to be able to look at like a portfolio approach to it. So when there's big winners like in conduit hydro, and it is very affordable and it's got a high ROI, eventually we're going to get to the point where there's going to be some types of technologies or interventions out there that aren't going to be as high, won't have as high of an ROI, but we're going to be able to balance it because we'll have a portfolio approach. And that's, I think, just looking at kind of the broad spectrum, I'm excited about this panel because I know they've implemented so many different types of technologies and fixes, and it's all part of a portfolio of solutions.
Thanks, Lindsay. All right, Clifford, what are you motivated by? What's inspiring your work in the conversation?
Yeah, first, again, thank you, Christina. It's really kind of an honor to be on this panel. As far as my interest, I mean, you really nailed it in the opening. I mean, we're seeing all the impacts of climate change, whether it's on the water supply, the wildfires that we're seeing. The wildfire season is starting up again in California, the heat stress, sea level rise. And I just wanted to put some numbers to this. I mean, because, you talked about the water energy nexus, but really that direct link between water and energy. I mean, the California Energy Commission, they had a number, 19% of California's total energy is related to water. Now, utilities are a smaller part, I think around 4%. The rest of it is heating, irrigation, industry, and agriculture. In the US, I think it's about the same. But then you can start looking worldwide, and you look at that percentage being higher, especially in water scarce regions. And, something that we need to think about as California becomes more water scarce. If you look at the Middle East, the electricity use is expected to go from 9% to 16% by 2040. And that's really largely because of the expansion of desalination. Now, there's good news to all this. Many of the states in the United States and countries, there are more renewable energy sources, or their facilities are being powered by renewable supplies. But, there was a UN report that talked about the majority of the electricity, 71%, is still from non-renewable sources. So, you know, that's really the reason. That's why I care, and that's really why we should all care. And I remember early in my career working on climate change studies, and I have to admit, you know, it seemed like a far away problem. But we're seeing the impacts today. You heard Greg talk about, you know, really the tragic hurricane Helene that's going through. You look at Phoenix, you know, I mean, I think they had, what, 112 degrees, 100 days, straight days of like 100+ degree weather. In California, we're seeing record droughts, you know, record rains. And even where a lot of my family are located in the San Joaquin Valley, in Porterville, where the wells have dried up. You know, you have emergency supplies filling up tanks for homeowners, but it's so hot that the water is scalding and they can't even use it. So again, you know, like I was saying, this isn't a faraway problem. And so how does it become personal? You know, my kids are going to have to deal with even worse impacts if we don't do something. And not just my kids, you know, the community, the environment, and water utilities use so much energy that really not only can we, but we really have to be part of the solution. And so I'll just end, you know, like, what am I hopeful about? I'm really particularly hopeful about the future generation of leaders. I mean, you know, I go out there, I talk to a lot of the college students. They are more aware and passionate about the environment, and they're really looking to us to start addressing the issue. And I think in turn, they're going to continue the work that we start to make the planet better.
Thanks, Clifford. That was really well said. Jane, I'll hand it off to you. What are your thoughts?
100% agree with everything that's been said so far. I mean, staving off the worst effects of climate change that we're doing in this decarbonization work is a water quality issue, right? You know, and this is, we have all of our infrastructure, it's built based on historical rainfall, historical climate, right? And now just, we're at this kind of inflection point where we're at risk of irreversibly altering you know, our climate on a human time scale. And so we kind of need to do everything possible in order to try to stave off those worst effects of climate change. What gets me really excited, what I'm really motivated for, is that I see so we've had goals for a long time, right? The New York City has established both energy and greenhouse gas reduction goals starting way back in 2007, and then we doubled down on them in about 2015. And so we've been working towards this. We're almost done with an energy and carbon neutrality study right now. And what we're recognizing is we have a big opportunity here, right? We have the ability to decarbonize the agency, right, which is something that we've been working on for, you know, the last 15+ years. But we're also seeing that, you know, we can interpret our goals very, very narrowly and just look at the agency, but actually within our built infrastructure, we have all of this opportunity to not just decarbonize ourselves, but to actually help to decarbonize the communities where we are. And this is a really exciting time in New York, right? We have and a lot of, you know, cities and states across the country, right? So not only are we trying to decarbonize, but we're trying to decarbonize all sectors of the economy. And there's a role that water and wastewater infrastructure can play, right? Like we can do historical, like the traditional renewables. You know, hydropower is something we've been doing for decades on all of our reservoirs. We have these really large campus size facilities that there's not a lot of land area in New York City, right? But we have these, you know, 50+ acre facilities for wastewater treatment plants, and we can host a lot of solar there by, you know, being innovative about putting solar over tanks. We have coastal facilities, so we could do some wind power. And then also just like within the infrastructure itself, you know, we can be the major outlet for food waste. You're kind of following the example of East Bay Mud, right? To do landfill diversion of food waste and actually create renewable energy out of it using existing in-place infrastructure. And also, you know, decades and decades of expertise operating anaerobic digestion. And the last piece that we've been really digging into lately is that, you know, within kind of all this temperate, we move around 1 billion gallons of wastewater a day, right? And that's temperate water flowing flowing through our pipes 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And then that can be a heat source and sink as all the buildings in New York City go to electrify their heating needs. And so I feel like it's a really big opportunity for us to play like an outsized role in decarbonization of our communities if we can just leverage our infrastructure, and I think that's an opportunity for our infrastructure to be recognized and used for its full value. And then that can kind of be tied back to state of good repair, that if people recognize how important the infrastructure is, not just for providing water, but also like kind of the environmental benefits that it can lend to decarbonization, I think it might help also with kind of our funding, and it can create additional revenue streams as well. So I feel like it's a really big opportunity for us to dig into, and I'm pretty excited about it.
Thanks for bringing some of those additional perspectives, Jane, and just the intersection of water to so many other elements within a healthy, thriving community. George, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. What are you driven by, passionate about? What are your thoughts?
Thank you, Christina. What a delight to be on this panel. What a fantastic group and an incredible level of experience. This panel wouldn't have even been formed 10 years ago. When some of us started on this. It's amazing how fast this field is changing. And it's great to see the righteous competition almost between enterprises doing so many creative things. That is fantastic. To me, what I'm energized by is I can't see how you cannot be focused on this issue, mainly for all the issues you've already heard. But these are existential survival questions for utilities and civilizations. This extreme weather we're facing, the advantage of doing this energy work is it's a principal response to very fundamental questions about our life on this planet. One of them is this question of extreme weather. Extreme weather is here now to stay. So while we have to be part of the solution of it getting better, it's not getting better anytime soon. So how are we going to manage water utilities that depend on power when we know extreme weather is now a reality? And the solutions that help solve global warming over a long period of time are also the same things you would do if you want your utility to operate better in the midst of extreme weather. So it's a solution that answers both components of climate change, what we do now, but also how we manage now, and then what we could do for the future. The other existential threat to me about what we do in the water sector is a financial cliff. EPA just identified that over the next 20 years, we need $1.2 trillion of funding for the water sector on drinking water and wastewater. There is never going to be enough money. With older systems, just like our homes as they age, they fall apart, they take more to run. But in parallel to that, we are responding to PFAS requirements we've never had before. We are replacing lead service lines. We have nutrient removal levels. There's so many issues that a utility has to face along with a retiring workforce, and we'll never have enough money. Now, the great opportunity to me, and this is why it excites me, is not only are we responding to the fundamental issue of the survival on the planet, it's the way a utility can survive. Have you already heard from the wonderful members of this panel? There are almost endless things that a utility can do to reduce their carbon footprint, to generate clean power, and here's the kicker, to improve their balance sheet. This is revenue they do not have. This is costs that you can cut, and you can take that revenue and plow it back in to doing all the other necessities that a utility needs to do. How many opportunities are that for any organization? I could take this step. And the last thing I'll say, and what I actually love the most, is it changes a utility's perspective. All three of the utilities on this call are already organizations that are pillars in their community. But a lot of other utilities are still making that change. And my sense is that as you do this work, your sense of who you are, our sense of self as a utility, what role do we play? How important are we to the community around us? What are the issues we care about changes? And that opens the door not only to the issues you do on energy, but how you interact with the community, what you worry about at justice, all the questions you've raised, Christina, and what is the best thing that you can do all three of those with one kind of topic. And that's where we are. I can hardly wait each day to think of what the next thing is going to come. So back to you, Christina.
I would say, Christina, I think the other thing, George, you kind of mentioned it, but you talk about competition, but the great thing about our industry, it's a friendly competition. And I mean, unlike other industries, we gladly share, copy, steal from each other. Whereas other industries like to keep all their secrets to themselves. We don't do that.
Yeah, we need to take advantage of that. So, well, I think it's just fascinating to listen to all of you. And I think the value of this conversation is to really create space to elevate these ideas, this optimism that there are challenges, but there are ways to push forward. And by making sure that that's spread throughout our industry, that gives others confidence to catalyze this forward in the organization. Ultimately, that's a goal of this conversation today. A couple takeaways for me that I think are imperative just to pause is that we cannot have the conversation about how we decarbonize this industry in a silo. It's not an either or. And based on the initial conversation, I mean, the intersection to community quality of life and water quality and availability and ecosystems and public health and financial resilience, all of this has to do with stability, and decarbonization is a big part to that stability and management. We cannot tackle these challenges if we are working in silos. To Clifford's point, we need to leverage the competitive advantage we have as an industry, being as collegiate and collaborative as we are. How do we actually build off that to solve problems, whereas other sectors don't have this advantage? How can we really use that? I think something I'm really excited about, and I really hope that this lands with everyone that's here, is that the water industry has a huge role to play in this conversation. And while we tackle these projects and opportunities within our communities, the aggregate impact of what we can do, because we are such large players in the energy consumption, but also the changes we make can amplify the benefit. So I want us to lean into our power as an industry, this competitive advantage, the optimism that we can. It does take leadership. It does take vision looking ahead. And so, I mean, it goes without challenges. In today's conversation, now getting into more of the details, there are challenges. It's how we move this through our organizations is an aspect that I hope others can learn from. So I'm going to dive in with some questions. I, of course, want to keep this pretty conversational, and I do see some questions already in the chat. So a shout out to people that are listening. And if you do have questions, drop it in the chat. I'm hoping we'll have time towards the end to get to some of them. So thanks for participating on that. So Jane, I want to start with you. New York City DEP is one of the largest water utilities in the world, for sure in the United States. There's a lot of different challenges as a water utility organization that New York City DEP is focused on. So in the role that you have with very clear ambitions to go carbon and energy neutral, how are you sort of approaching your work within all the other challenges that the utility is facing, like the really fundamentals of aging infrastructure as one of many examples? I'd love for you just to sort of create a reality check around your work for us.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are the largest water wastewater utility in North America, right? We serve 9 million people. And it's a huge capital plan, right? It's $30 billion over 10 years. And so it's a lot of projects that are kind of in flight, or being planned, designed, right? There's just a tremendous amount of work happening at all times. And so, when we first started working on this, actually I've only been a DEP for 7 years now, but prior to that I was a consultant for the Energy Office in DEP. So I've been actually working on this since we first set our greenhouse gas reduction goals. But we realized, like there are certain pain points as far as the, we have limited amount of resources, right? We have significant state of good repair issues. And then how do you compete? There's all of these kind of competing priorities that we need to navigate through. And so really what we try to do is prioritize, and a few people have mentioned this, I know George had mentioned this, is that really like the kind of no regrets, going after all the no regrets types of solutions, right? Like we need to do as much energy efficiency work as possible, trying to just bring down our operating budget, and then just trying to integrate as much of this work as possible into the normal design design process, right? And I think that, you know, there's a certain amount of catch up that we had to do for the projects that were already in flight. But I think for the projects, you know, that were being planned and in design, right, like having new design specs, we have a process within DEP that, you know, kind of looks at absolutely every single project. It calculates its greenhouse gas emissions impact and its energy impact, right? So both positive and negative, right, depending on what the project is. And we hold sustainability workshops to kind of talk through how that project can try to reduce energy and greenhouse gas emissions. And it kind of establishes this, like, this thought time, this thought space to figure out, like, you know, kind of instead of just doing this kind of, you know, typical replacement in kind, as it gives us an opportunity to have a discussion about, like, how can we integrate new technologies? How can we look at this a little bit different? How can we maybe divert a stream here or there in order to try and reduce energy and reduce greenhouse gas emissions? And it allows those conversations to happen within the organization, across the organization, right? So it's not just like one little group who's having this conversation, it's every single project. And that's been really, really successful. We've been doing that for about a dozen years now. And we've, you know, definitely learned things along the way, but I think we've really kind of refined that process now. And I think, you know, kind of across a portfolio of projects where you wouldn't anticipate that you'd be able to get any type of reductions, we're seeing about a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions just by having conversations about, like, about the HVAC and you know, just how things are operated. Do they need to be operated that way? So it's been really, really successful. The Office of Management and Budget have also integrated carbon capital budgeting. So now every single project across all the city agencies now need to report their carbon footprint. And so that's part of, like, the approval process. So there's just trying to create as much transparency and also put as much data out there as possible so everybody can kind of make informed decisions.
Yeah, and sounds like quite the process, Jade. I'm curious if there's a project you're really proud of. It sounds like there may be a number that you can speak to, but if you think about the broader water industry, is there anything you're really proud of that you think can be replicated with other agencies across the country?
Yeah, you know, I mean, there's a number of them, like you said. I think the thing that I'm most proud of and that we're really spending a lot of time working on is trying to expand our co-digestion program, right? We have 75 anaerobic digesters across New York City, right, across all 5 boroughs. And we have a lot of spare capacity. And I know that this is something that Clifford would be familiar with as well, right? So we have all of these digesters, and if through some just kind of simple modifications to their thickening process, right, we can actually free up a tremendous amount of spare capacity, and we have enough spare capacity to take the vast majority of the food waste that's generated within New York City. And so we're able to provide this kind of local outlet for food waste instead of trucking. You know, it's not like there's composting facilities right outside the city limits, right? Everything needs to be trucked hundreds of miles away. But if we're able to digest it, and we've had so much success digesting the food waste, so as you know, right, you may know that with typical wastewater solids, you're able to get about a 50% reduction in solids, and so 50% of it turns to biogas. Because food waste hasn't been digested through people the first time around, it actually digests really, really well, and we're seeing a greater than 75% reduction in solids. And so that's all turning into biogas. And so that actually reduces the amount that we eventually need to haul off to composting. And then also with all of this renewable energy that we're generating through the biogas, we're working on targeting towards the hardest to electrify users within the city, right? So everybody under kind of, you know, current local laws is going to need to electrify their heating needs, but there are these kind of very niche users that just need the higher temperatures of combustion until the technology catches up. And so we're trying to target those users, like the very last users of fossil fuel. We want to give them a non-fossil alternative. And so we're trying to, like, bring this all together into, like, a circular economy model. But it's really challenging because we're working across city agencies. We're working with lots of external partners, you know, kind of who owns all of this, how is this all working? We're kind of working through all those nuances. But it is really exciting that we're able to leverage existing infrastructure and existing expertise and really come up with a terrific kind of compounded environmental solution.
Yeah, that's amazing what's going on in New York City, and just it's such a great use case of policy collaboration, really coming together in such a diverse, complex footprint, I'm sure. So, and time and patience, you've been working on it.
Yes.
So that's so exciting. Thanks for sharing, Jane. Clifford, just to transition to you. East Bay Mud, based in California, has some pretty aggressive, I would say bold, climate action goals. Can you share a little bit about what you're setting out to achieve, and what are some challenges that you're facing as an organization to achieve those?
Yeah, no, happy to talk about that. I was, kind of reflecting back when Jane was talking about how they, set a goal. What you said back in 2007, I think, you first set the goal. I was just thinking back when we first set our goal and looking back at our old plans, and our original goal was set back in 2003, and it really wasn't a goal for greenhouse gas reduction. It was just in 2003. It was more of a statement. We're going to start tracking our greenhouse gas emissions. I think you have to start somewhere to track it. We did set a goal, but the goal wasn't to reduce our emissions. The goal was actually to reduce our energy use, and the goal was set to be a 20% reduction in energy use by 2010. And, things that we're talking about here is, to make it tangible, something like, first get to the business case. Can you save money? Then in 2008, we started seeing that we were able to meet the goal. And then in 2008, we set another goal that was based on the emissions, saying, let's reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 10% by 2015. And we started making investments in photovoltaics, hybrid vehicles, at least on the passenger and light truck side. More, looking at how we can make our operations more efficient, purchasing cleaner power from community choice aggregators. By 2013, we're continuing, we're making good progress. So then we set our goal to be carbon free for indirect emissions, which is really the electricity we use by 2040, and cut our direct emissions in half by that same time frame. Again, we're making good progress. So in 2020, and I think what you're talking about, Christina, we said, look, we're making good progress. We're ahead of our goal. Let's be more aggressive and say we want to be carbon free for both our direct and indirect emissions by 2030. And really, the reason why I'm sharing this chronology with you is because we didn't pick that goal when we started. It was a journey. And I think it's really a journey for a lot of people to get to the goal, to see what your agency has the capacity to do. You asked about the challenges. This is not without challenges. There are easier things to do. The electricity you use, we're fortunate in California. There are community choice aggregators and our power providers that provide clean energy. This is relatively easy to do. You can just buy cleaner power, but there is a price premium. A little harder, but still relatively easy, is you can build photovoltaics. And we do it through a power purchase agreement, so we don't have to come up with the initial capital cost to build it. We just finished our 5 megawatt PV facility. That's going to save us about $1 million a year in energy costs. And then we have, I was listening to Jane talk about the capital improvement program. We have lots of work to do. And so over time, we're making our equipment more and more efficient. This is going to be a slow process. This is going to take time. There are some things that we haven't figured out yet. Our fleet makes up 16% of all of our greenhouse gas emissions. There is no market for the medium and heavy duty equipment that we use. Whether it's the backhoes or the dump trucks, we still rely on diesel. We switched completely to renewable diesel, but we still rely on diesel. But I think one of the challenges we're all going to face is, even if there is a market, we have to think about, how do we respond to an emergency? Can we get the electricity? Can we get the hydrogen if they have hydrogen power after an earthquake? It's really easy to truck in diesel, much harder to truck in electricity. And so this is something we have to deal with. Another big challenge are process emissions from the wastewater related activities. The science, that's still developing. We actually don't include the process emissions in our goal, but as a policy, we said we're going to continue to track it, and we're going to report on the emissions so we're aware of it, and we're not there yet. And finally, one area that I don't think many people have a handle on is, how do we deal with Scope 3 emissions? Scope 3 emissions, how do we track it? How do we inventory it? How do we choose to address those emissions? That's challenging. We're focusing on the Scope 1 and 2 emissions, but Scope 3 that's going to be a bear.
Those are all really good challenges, and where we need to work through the solutions, right? So I think the point about fleet is really important, even if the market of equipment was where it needs to be. How you manage resiliency and just your fundamental need to serve the community at all times can be compromised. So very practical challenges that I think we need to work through. But a big takeaway, Clifford, was start somewhere. And I think that staged approach is very encouraging for folks that maybe not have the resources or supportive leadership like you all are giving your organizations. What might be some meaningful ways that they can get started? So I want to round out the thoughts on the utility side. So Lindsay, I'll go to you. When we chatted previously, you were talking about the complexity and challenge of just up against capital projects, the traditional capital project planning process for utility. And some of these projects focus on energy efficiency or decarbonization, integration of renewable energy might not have a pathway within the traditional capital planning, longer cycle engineering. So I'd like to just hear from you. I mean, how are you thinking about this at Molten Nagel? Do you have any examples of how you're sort of working around this?
Yeah. Yes. Thanks for asking. So I probably represent more of what the average size utility is. We have about 170,000 customers and we have less than 200 staff. And we've got about a $650 million 10-year capital or CIP plan. And so, and yeah, it's a tough process to get in on that. We don't have the economies of scale of, say, a larger utility. So when we're looking at, what projects are we going to prioritize in year 1, year 3, year 10? It's you try not to present a case where the energy efficiency or renewable energy project is pitted against a needed project like rehabilitation, because you don't want the perspective to be, well, it's this or that. It can be this and that. And so we've got several major projects coming up where we're rehabilitating lift stations. And in cases where we're doing a very large rehabilitation, we're looking at updating our standard specs and just our design processes to do energy analyses from the get-go, do renewable energy or even battery storage from the get-go. And that way it's incorporated as part of the rehabilitation and is not at odds with the rehabilitation or whatever project is on the schedule. And I would say the other thing too is as water people, we don't really know energy quite as well. And it's kind of a black hole. I mean, it would be for the uninitiated. And so I think part of it, and I like what Jane said, is you have to have conversations. You got to get started telling people, like, here's probably the level of effort. You have to bring in experts who know what they're talking about and make your staff feel at ease with it and know that it's not as scary as it sounds. If anything, it's probably going to be complementary to the efforts that we're doing. And so one of the approaches that I am going to be taking or have taken is that looking at the portfolio and make it a 10-year portfolio, because that's right in alignment with your CIP. And if they can see that you're going to be essentially making money right away and actually helping to bring down the cost of the total CIP plan, like, I think there's a lot more openness to incorporating projects around year 5, year 6, year 7, because look, I'm generating a payback. Like, because my project, you're going to be able to get your project done faster because it's not going to cost as much. And so there really is a lot of complementarity in the planning process. And then the further out that I think all staff can see it, the more open they are, because it's not going to catch them as a surprise. You can bring in the resources as needed, either permanently or temporarily as needed, well in advance. And it just gets everybody set up for success to have the conversations early and understand the alignment of the goals.
And Lindsay, very just practical. Yeah, very practical. And it goes back to collaboration and working across the aisle within your organization. Just for clarification, when you are talking about the energy analysis, are you also looking at, so that's energy efficiency and renewable energy, are you looking at other criteria or data points around carbon reduction and greenhouse gas reduction, or is it simply a calculation based on kilowatt per hour?
Yeah, for right now, for the most part, the biggest driver is cost. I would say we've got our energy costs went up 40% in the last 2 years. We saw 4 rate adjustments in 2022. We are in the highest cost service area for energy, because we're paying on average around 28 cents per kilowatt hour. It's very pricey here. And so the goal is really to hedge against costs and mitigate the impact of costs. But I will say that we have done a lot of effort to just shift our operations and do load shifting and look for peak shavings as a way to reduce the amount of carbon intensity in the energy that we do use. And so it's not without that. It is a driver, but I would say the primary driver right now is to just try to mitigate costs and then make sure that we can get projects done at the end of the day that benefit customers and help keep our rates low.
Great. Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. I want to transition to Greg, who, again, back to the optimist entrepreneur, evangelist for looking at how we can harness some renewable energy from flowing water in pipes, and also solve another problem around pressure management that a lot of water utilities face. I feel like, in our past conversations, Greg, you're up against these traditional project cycles and traditional design, and your solutions plugging into an infrastructure asset. So how are you overcoming the challenges of how to get involved and work with the utility to show a payback? How are you navigating, and are there some solutions or ideas that are working for how you're tackling this?
Yeah, thanks. I want to kind of build on what Lindsay was saying, because when I first started InPipe, we were generating renewable energy, and it was pretty clear that for most water utilities, energy just wasn't that important. It was something that they knew about, but there was so much critical stuff needing to be done in terms of just keeping the infrastructure viable. And, it was basically pipes, pumps, and valves. And so what we have seen is increasingly, like, the interest in decarbonization in the industry is definitely accelerating. But I think that, if we really want to move the industry, that, talking about decarbonization or carbon emissions or climate change is really difficult if we're not talking about costs. And I think we need to couple them together in a way that all water utilities are concerned about the costs of water to their customers, and especially underserved communities that just don't have the resources to, do these, detailed 10-year plans with consultants and so forth. They have the same challenges, but without the staff, without the capital, and so forth. And so at InPipe, what we try to do is really help them tap into this source of energy so that they can either reduce their operating costs or generate a new revenue stream, which, by the way, reduces carbon emissions. But it's very few customers that we talk to, honestly, that care about carbon emissions. It's really about payback. And so we're doing a couple things on payback that I think a lot of entrepreneurs are tapping into. One is that the federal government has, basically trillions of dollars focused on improving energy infrastructure that for decarbonization, that water utilities should definitely take advantage of. And these are incentives that up till a few years ago were only applied for solar and wind power. But there's lots of new technologies, including the hydro excess, that qualify for that capital. And this is easy money. This isn't competitive money. I mean, it could stop, and we're concerned that it might. But basically, there's a thing called a direct pay option that utilities basically fill out a form, and the feds are going to send you a check, for example, in the hydro excess projects, for half the cost. Another thing that we're trying to do, because we generate energy from our system, is to be able to further de-risk the deployment by selling the energy to water utilities for less than they could buy it previously. And this is a way, so Lindsay was talking about, like, put these innovations into a CIP plan over the next 10 years. Well, as an entrepreneur, that's tough to hear. And so what we think is that we could further bring capital to the industry, our own, just like the solar energy industry does, or just the battery industry. All renewables do this. and we can sell energy for, let's say, 20% less than they're currently buying it from the electric utility, and provide a continuous source of energy that reduces their operating costs. And then in the future, they can buy it and operate it as part of their CIP plan. So those are a couple ways that we're trying to help water utilities reduce the costs of delivering water, and especially in rural communities, they really should take advantage of these incentives and grants that are available for improving water infrastructure.
It's good to know about the direct pay option. I'm less familiar with that. So easy check comes in the mail from the federal government. Sounds too good to be true, Greg.
Call me.
But
I'll
we
tell you
should
all
be
about
taking advantage of it if it's there.
Yeah.
Can I just echo what Greg was saying about that? I mean, I completely agree. And sometimes with the investment tax credit, you know, we've never been eligible for that before. Like we've always had to like work through some other third party that, you know, because they're, you know, because they pay taxes, they can get a tax credit. But we've managed to, with some projects that we already kind of had in the works, we're able to leverage the investment tax credit, which is terrific. It is a lot of there's a lot of benefit to it. I also wanted to just there was a question in the chat about how to accelerate renewable energy projects, and I know for us, you know, and just like as Greg was saying, like doing some kind of power purchase agreement was really like that's how we do almost all of our solar. We own a few solar panels, but generally we do power purchase agreements, and it really is kind of the same cost to us or a little bit less than what we pay for conventional electrical. And so we think that's a solution that works really well. And just in general, like wherever we're able to do kind of, you know, even our co-digestion program and our gas to grid program, like all of that started with us doing no cost demonstrations, or, you know, kind of, you know, in order to kind of get over that initial hurdle of like, we don't want to be competing with, you know, state of good repair work, right? Like if we can do projects for little or no cost, like those are the ones that get through, and then they can be proofs of concept. And so like our next iterations of, you know, co-digestion and gas to grid, we're going to own the infrastructure. Like we've decided that we want to do it because we want to have more control over where it goes. But it was really good for proof of concept to be able to go in there and start with projects that didn't cost the agency anything. And so in that way, it really reduces the risk and also kind of keeps the skeptics a little bit at bay.
But I mean, I'll say, I mean, you know, we have one of Greg's systems installed in our area, and you kind of hear Lindsay and Jane talking about it. You know, there are other capital projects. I mean, there's always something else that's going to crowd out, you know, a strictly, you know, renewable energy project. So I think in part you have to do it because it demonstrates to people when you do other projects that have the urgency, you could build it into an existing project and it will work. And so you have to do it first to show them that it will work. But if I just said, do this project that's strictly based on reducing the energy use, forget the really urgent projects, you know, that's a hard conversation when you have the people, when you're talking to people who are operating and maintaining a system. And, you know, at least for East Bay Mud, when you look, I mean, if you really step back and you just focus on the cost, you know, while energy is our single largest non-labor cost at 15%, you know, that operating cost is only 7% of our overall budget. So 15% of 7% is only 1% is our electricity cost. 99% of our other costs is everything else. So while the project may make sense, it's hard to have a conversation in the big CIP when you have all these other projects. That's why I think you have to go forward and you have to say, tell staff, you're going to do this project so people have faith and confidence that the technology works. So when you do those other urgent projects, they can incorporate that.
But Clifford, can I just ask you a quick question about that? So, you know, there's a lot of water utilities in the United States and in the world. And if it's really difficult as an entrepreneur to do pilots with every one of them. And yet it's almost the requirement is that every water utility just seems to want to see it work in their system. And, you know, is it that every water utility is so different? Or is there more, you know, how do we accelerate that so that innovation happens faster?
I don't think we're that different. And I think, Christina, we've had this conversation before. And I think there's a model that we could use that we, you know, that we don't as an industry do that we can, is really what they do in the scientific industry. And, you know, I mean, you have somebody that does the research, you have somebody that peer reviews it, and then we trust this study, meets all of our needs. And I can say, well, Jane did it in New York. It was peer reviewed by Lindsay. I don't have to do another pilot. And then we can accelerate that, as opposed to, which is a killer for you, is East Bay Mud wants to do a pilot. I mean, New York is doing a pilot right now on your system, and maybe Lindsay is going to do a pilot, and you're just running around doing pilot after pilot after pilot. I think there's a model we can follow that's already developed in the scientific industry, where you have a peer review process that we can all trust the results and say, if it works for them, it'll work for us. But that's going to take some effort and coordination to make it happen.
Lindsay, go
I'll
ahead.
add to that too. Yeah, since we're also installing a hydro excess, I think what helped for us, and I want to say thanks to Clifford, is that EB Mud installed theirs back in October of last year, and our operations staff, who are, they're the water guys. They're not energy guys. They're the water guys. They want to go talk to other water guys who are running energy systems and say, how are you doing this? How is it working? Is it challenging? Have you had any problems with it? And it's really a very word of mouth kind of thing. They'll feel comfortable hearing from another operator. And I know that they came back from that visit and told us, okay, I think we can do this. And we went from actually a pilot stage of just installing one turbine to now installing two. And hopefully by next year, we'll be generating 800,000 kilowatt hours a year. So it was, it helped get over that hurdle to know that there was some collegiality, some shared information from somebody that they trust, because that guy operates the system. So do I. So I'll say that scientific consensus and helpful, and that's helpful for me, but for an operator, I think that was helpful for them. So maybe there's two paths that we need to walk down.
Definitely having a bit of show and tell, and that sharing is such a key component. And even if there needs to be some demonstration, Greg, I think your call to action is there a way to reduce that time of demonstration? And what is the opportunity to have a commitment on the back end to go from demonstration to action is a big challenge, not just in decarbonization technologies, but as an industry that we can continue. A couple things, I think the opportunity, Clifford, what you triggered for me and some of your thoughts for East Bay Mud, and Lindsay, it sounds like Milton Nagel is looking at this too, and Jane, no doubt you'd have that, is when you have a use case for a project, whether it's the hydro excess or another solution, how can that be replicated so you can achieve economies of scale and value internally, not just as an industry? So I think that's really interesting. All right, so we've talked a lot about partnerships and money. There's a couple questions I'd like to get to. There's so many things I want to get to. George, I want to come to you on business models and the use case and maybe creative partnerships. But before we transition, in addition to the direct pay option, are there any other funding resources that you all are using that you want to just share with the audience, since that seems to be a key question in the chat? What other tools to finance and offset the cost from incentives funding are out there?
Well, I can add to that, but I'm in California. Oh, sorry, George. I'll be brief. We have the self-generation incentive program, which is something that's run in California. In addition, for the in-conduit hydro, there's also the Section 242, basically a performance reimbursement program that the U.S. Department of Energy runs. So you generate a certain amount of kilowatt hours, and each year you submit that amount that you generated, and you get a per kilowatt hour incentive back, and that's a 10-year performance-based program. So there's lots of stuff, state, local, and national, that you could look at.
Great. Go ahead, George.
Christy, I was going to say, in most jurisdictions, the Public Utility Commission require energy efficiency projects as part of the rate structure for the power companies. I was surprised to learn that at DC Water. And when we started on our energy efficiency projects back in 2008, we started with that incentive program. That second, you can use SRF funding for green energy projects. It is capital, not operating. So you always have to worry about your operational costs. But SRF is definitely a source. And of course, there's the renewable funds that green banks are, because these projects do have a payoff, there are now funded green banks around the country that can present very low cost, very desirable funding sources. And I wanted to shift because I actually, listening to the conversation has been fascinating. Having done 11 budgets over my time and presented them to the customers in DC, and we're sort of in between the small and the big, we're about a $6 billion. The reality is there's always more work than money. So there's always going to be trade-offs as to which project you decide to do and what not to do. And we did a lot of clean energy projects at DC Water. We never characterized them primarily as carbon capture or energy efficiency projects. In our case, we have an authorizing statute that established the DC Water and Sewer Authority. Nowhere in it did it say anything about doing energy as part of our work. And our agency didn't think that way. It did think very much about affordability. It's a firefight in any jurisdiction to get more revenue for the work that you need to do. And so the idea that we could present to our board projects that responded to affordability, to our customers and to our ability to operate, that rose very quickly on what was gained attention in a CIP. And the second was the understanding that when you do projects that save money, that actually increases the revenue you have for all the years that follow to do the work that you might not do in year one. So as a cash flow basis, you were going to do more for the work of the enterprise, not less. And that was a case that had to be made. And what I was interested to find out is we never thought that way as a public utility. That's very common or more common, I would say, in the private sector. It required a way of thinking that was different. And as soon as we started thinking that way, all sorts of different projects started getting prioritized differently because we had an affordability outcome, something of absolute priority to the board and all our customers. We had a long-term financing option, an absolute priority to all our customers. And then on the third basis, my biggest fear running a water utility was the loss of power, because everything we could do to respond to any other problem required power. And so we presented many of our energy efficiency projects as resiliency. This is how our system will operate. If there's a problem on the grid, we can generate this kind of, and so it was answering all of these truly fundamental purposes of the agency. And oh, by the way, they also reduced carbon footprint and did carbon capture. But I remember presenting to the board, the largest single discretionary project DC Water will probably ever do was the Canby-based thermal hydrolysis at $500 million. We never mentioned carbon footprint until the very end, even though it was the largest carbon capture project in the mid-Atlantic, because it saved us money, cash flow positive day one. It reduced our liability for biosolids disposal day one. It presented 13 megawatts of power on our site, resiliency, not day one, but fairly soon after we got it up and running. And those reasons persuaded our board, this is discretionary. It wasn't mandated. It wasn't required. It wasn't fixing old infrastructure. It was a decision the board made because of those three priorities. And I believe for those of you on the line, every one of your utilities can present that case to your customers, to your mayor, to your council. And at least in my experience, in a pretty tough world, there was a lot of positive outcome from that. I'll mention a few other little things. I was interested to find that when we adopted a budgeting process, that if one of our division directors figured out a project that would save money, they could claw back some of the savings and plow it back into their operation. Another issue of public sector finance, if you do, I'm going to spend $100 this year, next year I'm going to drop it down to $80, what benefit do I get? All I have is a smaller budget next year. What's the incentive, other than feeling good about it? What's the incentive that will drive me like profits in a private firm? So he said, well, you save some money in your budget. We'll take some of that, give it back to you, and you can do some project you've always wanted to do and never had the funding for. So now you created incentive. Again, that's not a carbon capture incentive. That's just a straight, it was walkie-talkies for one place. It was all these things that they wanted. And all of a sudden, because they did those projects, they were able to do it. So you put these mechanisms in place, every utility can do this, then the system starts generating these outcomes just by the way it's operating because of the cases you're making. And I think you've heard elements of that from every one of the speakers, and I love it. But it changes the way the utility operates in its budgeting function, and then all these outcomes start to change as a result.
I think, George, I mean, a big fundamental opportunity is how we present the business case to advance projects and how we're essentially presenting the information and telling the story, and some of the things that you really honed in on: affordability, resilience, and carbon was sort of the icing on the cake if you wanted to extrapolate and call it out for the impact that it was making on carbon reduction. But it was really back to the fundamental basics that mattered most to the utility and also the customer base. So I just think that's really interesting to emphasize that. And also the Canby example is not a rehabilitation project like Lindsay is really focused on at Molten Nagel. It's new infrastructure. It's new money that needs to be spent, 500 million at that, which is a very big investment. So it's interesting to sort of look at it from two lenses of rehabilitation to maintain and update aging infrastructure, and the challenge of getting new projects and new technology. Canby was one of the DC was one of the first adopters in North America, if not the first, right, at the time?
At the time it was the first, but I want to emphasize one key point because everyone has talked about it. What about the essential work that the utility needs to do? We wanted to make sure we made the case. Say you're doing a 5 or 10 year CIP, that if we do this project in year 1 and have this cash flow savings, here's all the work we will get to do in addition to the plan in the years that follow. Then it's not only cash flow positive, it is essential project positive. And you pair those things, and all of a sudden you start building these compelling cases and enable outcomes that, at least when you start, seem like they're that's a big challenge to overcome. But I think it can be done for any of the utilities on the line.
And I think, I mean, what George is saying, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, George, and I think what you're hearing from everybody is, you know, as we do this capital budget prioritization, I mean, you know, too often we get into like, what's the urgency? You know, we do have a regulatory compliance, a safety, operational reliability issue, you know, and I think it's great that, you know, we focus on, is it saving money? Are we cash flow positive on day one? But I do think as you start incorporating other factors into the prioritization, you look at climate change adaptability or environmental stewardship, you know, I think as you maybe become a little more mature, you know, you're changing that discussion. So you're shifting that conversation from short-term expenditures to long-term savings, long-term risk mitigation. And when you look at, you know, prioritizing and looking at sustainability and capital planning, then you're moving away from these traditional metrics and now looking at, you know, these longer term reducing emissions, improving efficiency. And then I think the other benefit, and I think George, you mentioned this too, and I think others have mentioned this as well, is then when you make the business case, not just to your board and you create this transparency, but you can also communicate to the public, you know, about the reliability, the potential savings, the resiliency, the environmental benefits of these projects. Because at the end of the day, your board has to buy in on the budget. And if you can communicate transparently, we looked at all of these things when we evaluate the projects, and this was one of the factors. And you start shifting away from the, you know, fire drill after fire drill capital program to longer term resilient sustainable planning. You know, I think that is the evolution that I think everybody needs to get to.
Christina, real quick, I would say what it offers is hope, because I think what most utilities face is this crushing financial precipice where we won't have enough money. And if you can go to a ratepayer and say, there's a picture here of hope because we can improve the balance sheet, then all of a sudden the conversation becomes hopeful for the future rather than beleaguering. And I think that's what we can offer. That's what they're doing in New York City. By the way, the very first plan I read in 2007 was Plan NYC. So yes, we all learn from each other, and it's a wonderful way to improve. And I was always watching Clifford. I always had my eye on him, and anything that's not illegal, immoral, or unethical, he's doing and it's good, I will take it in a heartbeat. So I think that's a great thing about the water sector. We all borrow happily from each other.
Well, that's fantastic. And I just want to like state the reality is that I think your point is well taken, George, of the fact that we need to free up additional capital to keep up with the investment that is required, which is only increasing with advanced treatment requirements, with PFAS and biosolids and all these other emerging topics that we as an industry will need to find the money to be able to meet. And so it's sort of inevitable that we tackle the business case for projects in a more holistic, creative way outside of the status quo to really capture the multi-benefits and help move these along. I want to bring in maybe a challenging aspect of this conversation that I see our industry really challenged with right now, which is in that conversation of making a business case for either an operational change or a capital investment is how we quantify the value of carbon. So when we do a life cost analysis, the greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted from the process or change, as well as this sort of value that we quantify, paints this life cost analysis in a different lens, right? You do your net present value life cost analysis, but when we take in the value of carbon and the carbon emissions and bring that into projects, it sort of can help make a decision of, do we do status quo, or is changing this solution or approach meaningful, even if the capital cost is higher up front? And frankly, Sweden, Switzerland, and Canada are the only jurisdictions that I think I've seen really do this, and maybe you all can correct me on that. But what do you think about being able to quantify the value of carbon and bringing that into projects? Is this something that you're talking about? Do you think this is necessary for us as a sector to really think through our projects in a different way? Clifford, I'll start with you, and if anyone wants to chime in, please do.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's different ways of looking at this, what the status quo, and like, are we going to do this? I mean, what we did, I mean, we were looking at saying, let's say we couldn't buy clean energy and we couldn't implement a single capital project, but we still wanted to have this goal, and I know carbon credits are imperfect and have problems, but, you can always say, let's compare it to something. And so we looked at it and said, what if we chose, we're going to offset all of our emissions with carbon credits? And we looked at a range of, the cost for a credit per metric ton, and just said, what is the impact on rates? Like, if we just wanted to just do that at a bare minimum, what's the impact on rates? And so when we did the analysis back in 2020, when we set that goal to be carbon neutral by 2030, on our water rates, it was a 0.12% impact on rates for a year. And so we looked at this and said, you know what, for that, at an absolute minimum, if our board was okay to raise the rates by that much to buy the credits, they were good with it. And then if we can do these projects that we're all talking about, that is cash flow positive on day one, then we can just do all these projects, and it's better than this. I mean, that's just one way of looking at this, to try to convince yourself we should do something, as opposed to, oh my gosh, this problem is so big, I don't know where to start. Should I do this project? Should I do that project? What is the bare minimum you can possibly do, and what will it cost you? And if that makes sense, then every other cash flow positive project that you put out there is going to make sense. And it's not this is going to cost the utility a whole lot of money. At least put a dollar amount and a rate impact on this one to understand where you are on the spectrum of, can I do this or not? And so that's what we did.
So Christina, so water is historically cheap. Energy is historically cheap. It's hard to get an ROI. But today, water rates are going up. Energy costs are rising at least 4 or 5 times the rate of inflation. Carbon is still really cheap in the United States. And maybe it'll be valuable in the future. And there are some water utilities that I know of that are making a fortune on carbon emissions, or collecting carbon and then monetizing those credits. And so I would encourage people to quantify the number of credits. But in terms of putting it into a pro forma, it's very complex. And I think it just adds another layer of complexity that slows things down. And I think we're better off focusing on, the really tangible capital costs, which are a significant part of the ROI on a project, rather than getting it bogged down on carbon emissions at this point. That could change, in 5 or 10 years. But so far, the carbon markets in the US are not very robust. And so for companies that are just trying to monetize carbon savings and stuff, it just isn't very compelling. And those projects hardly ever happen. So that would be my 2 cents about it, just from a practical perspective. And other people might have other views. George probably does. George, what do you think? Or even Jane. Jane, you're head of decarbonization. What do you think about the value of carbon in proforming these projects?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that we've toyed around with. It's not something that we're actively using. And as part of the carbon capital budgeting program, the Office of Management and Budget is looking at that and trying to figure out what the cost of carbon is. And so that's something that, like, on the city level, we're looking at. There's just a couple of other points here, is that New York State is kind of they're starting kind of the draft outline for them to have a cap and invest program. And so that's going to set our carbon, we're going to, and it's their water, wastewater utilities are an obligated party. So we're going to have to pay into this. And so that actually has suddenly brought that conversation to the fore, right? And so with, like, everything that we're doing, if we're increasing carbon and, how much that's going to cost us. And then also, these are the projects that are kind of putting us most at risk for large, payments to the state, kind of, we haven't, because it's still draft and we don't have numbers around it yet, but we know it's coming, and I think it's, unfortunately, it's a stick rather than a carrot. But, it is something that's entering the conversation more and more.
Christina, my thought on this relates to your prior comment that you summarized what many of us have been saying. Having done many, many rate hearings, and I had 3 police officers with me when I did those, the most important story I needed to be able to tell my customers was not about carbon cap, it was the affordability of what are we doing to improve your service and lowering cost. And what I love about energy efficiency projects is they deliver both. So I was always looking for them, and we actually got our rate increases approved. But that first door was the first part of every presentation. Can we present to our ratepayers a story that demonstrates that we are working better this year than last year? Again, that wasn't something that we thought about in the old days. Public agencies don't often do that. But the stereotype of us is that we're inefficient and we're bloated. And I hate that, by the way. It's not my experience, but it is a stereotype. So if we can prove that's not true, look at all the things Clifford has done this year that we didn't do last year. They're making us more efficient. We're doing this, we're doing that. That opens a door for the customer to see the utility in a completely different way. And every utility of every size is capable of opening that door and building that kind of relationship with the customers they serve. And that's why this learning from the people on this panel is so much fun, because this is replicable. It can be done anywhere, and it will change the manner in which the utility is interacting with the people they serve.
And I get what you're saying, Greg, and George, of course. I mean, about when you talk to the customers, I do, practically the exact same thing that you do. But at some point, to move this along, you need your board to set a policy. I mean, you got to establish a policy, and you got to convince them that this policy is doable. And you can't talk about a policy project by project. You have to look at some comparison of something. Here's the advantage. We set the policy at 2030 as a goal. Now, from a staff level, everybody can talk about this is a policy set by our board. When you go out to the public, you don't talk about how you got to the policy. You just now say, here are all these projects we're doing. And by the way, we want to be carbon neutral by 2030. But you have to get some way to get your board to agree that this is a good policy that's not just aspirational but doable. And how do you have that conversation? I'm sure every utility has their own way of doing it. This is how we did it. You need to get a policy that gets everybody in line saying this is where we're going.
Yeah. I think, something that we won't have enough time to get into today, and I just already see the time, I can't believe the time has flown by, is clearly, at a fundamental and basic level, we can do better to focus on how we achieve affordability and level of service for communities that water agencies, water utilities serve, where looking at energy efficiency and integration of renewal can accelerate projects and achieve those. It's an enabler, a tool. Something that we're not talking about is achieving net zero by 2030, or even some of the goals that AWWA have set by 2050 is not going to be achievable if we don't drive more boldly and quickly. And some of the challenges I see for our industry is beyond the sort of basics of looking at low-hanging fruit projects. We have the opportunity cost of not doing anything or not having more transformative change. And something that I think our industry needs to spend more time talking about is quantifying risk, and what is that risk of not doing anything, or the opportunity cost. And this really ties to the conversation around data integrity, the quality of data that we have for decision making. So just one point is, century storms, which by definition happens once every century, are happening at a frequency within years and less than a decade in most cases. So it is becoming very challenging in how we as organizations are looking at making decisions within this sort of framework of data that is essentially obsolete. And do we need to be doubling down on investments and bigger scale projects? And how does that sort of shift the conversation? With that said, we're not going to get into it today. I do want to give folks some opportunity. We've gone through some of the questions here and I think have organically answered that. There's one question in the chat that I think is interesting and want to see who wants to take it. So some of this ties to the Scope 3 emissions, Clifford, that you were highlighting, which is looking at the supply chain and the stakeholders. So if you think about water utilities and the broader ecosystem of partners, suppliers, and the service providers, how are you all thinking about those types of partnerships down the supply chain? Are there any policies or conversations that you're having? And if anyone wants to jump in to answer that, would welcome that.
I mean, we're for sure looking at that, right? I mean, is like the buying power of New York City government is tremendous, right? And so we're kind of working toward, in some ways willing to pay a little bit of a premium to kind of have a decarbonized product that we're purchasing, and then hopefully, like with with that tremendous buying power, that'll hopefully like grow the industry in that particular area. And so one example of that, and it wasn't with DEP, it was with kind of the citywide fleet. So we recently procured renewable diesel. It's like the first renewable diesel contract at a municipality east of the Rockies. And I know there's a lot of it out west and it's awesome. So, but borrowing from that model, right, we were able to procure it here, and it's actually not that expensive, and it's kind of opening up that pathway like along the East Coast as far as being able to, because, as I think Clifford had said early on, right, we have all these fleets that we just can't electrify yet, right? And so like moving to renewable diesel is at least a step in the right direction. And so we're looking at that for chemicals, looking at concrete specifications across all of city government, looking at steel specifications, like all of that, like trying to decarbonize as much as possible. And so I think that New York City, as one of the largest cities in the country, recognizes the influence that we can have in trying to push the needle on reducing life cycle emissions.
Yeah, and I mean, as far as renewable diesel, I mean, we piggybacked on some cities, but for us, renewable diesel was the same price as regular diesel. It's completely fungible, so it's a very easy financial decision to make. Just quickly, the other thing that we're doing is, within our procurement, we ask the manufacturers two things. Share with us, if you have it, the emissions from the products, and tell us what you're doing to reduce the emissions. So I think part of it is just starting that conversation too.
That's great. With the few minutes we have left, I'm going to see if anyone wants to tackle this one. And maybe George, this is you. So there's a couple questions here that are really just interested in nature-based sort of low-tech solutions around decarbonization. I know you're doing a lot of work in rural and underserved communities. What are your thoughts on the opportunity for nature-based or low-tech solutions on the decarbonization front?
I was just typing out an answer because Rick Bacon asked a question like that. And my reaction is they're even more relevant for lower resourced utilities than almost anyone else. There are a lot of solutions that are not can-be, never been done before. An efficient pump, and there's so many things a utility can do that are well understood. They don't require a pilot. They have long established. In most of the places we go, these are wonderful people working incredibly hard, but they're 10 people understaffed and their budget is already, so they're not doing these things not because they aren't good people. They need someone who has done it before, the notion of a utility person, talking to them and helping them through the process. And there's a network now called Environmental Finance Centers that EPA has set up that's established for exactly that reason. And I have to say, energy projects are just about our favorites because they're the one element we can deliver to a utility, a project that will improve their balance sheet. With projects that are well understood, we can walk them through and help them understand and train their operators. That's another huge issue. As well, our people know how to operate these new techniques when we put them in place. But it's almost like the sun is coming up. In a world where I'm always trying to keep up and seem to be falling behind, this offers this ray of hope that there's a set of projects that are well understood that New York and Molten Miguel and Clifford have spearheaded, but they're pretty well understood and we can transfer them. And I think it's an imperative in our industry that we figure out how to do that well.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you, George, Clifford, Lindsay, Jane, and Greg for being part of this conversation. I feel like we could have added a couple more hours and still had a lot more to talk about. And I want to thank everyone that dialed in to join and listen in. I hope you all are walking away learning some new perspectives, inspired of the role that you can play, and just can bring back some more creative thinking, problem solving to the space that you work within. And if I could just leave one message that's really resonating with me is that the water industry as a collective has incredible power. And if we can lean into that power and work together, there is a role that we can play in the decarbonization space while we're tackling all the fundamental challenges ahead of us. So we hope to continue the conversation. Thank you again for all your inspirational leadership and being here. And we'll see y'all soon. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Much.
Bye.